Welcome to the Sons of Liberty podcast, coming to you from the Liberty Tree Studio in San Antonio, Texas, where we discuss topics of the day, firearms, great food, and even better whiskey. Grab a drink, sit down with your host, the founding daddies, Mike Mahalski and Kyle Grothus.
Howdy guys, this is Kyle and Mike from Sons of Liberty, and we are here with Cody, who I'm not even going to try your last name, from Firearms Policy Coalition, and you are a constitutional lawyer, I believe. And what's your title at FPC?
So I'm actually president at FPC Action Foundation, which is the sister organization of FPC, and we work together to accomplish that shared mission of achieving a world of maximal human liberty. But yes, I am an attorney. I started out as a litigator and have just worked my way into this role.
Awesome. Yeah, we're here to discuss kind of all the wild, exciting things that have been happening over the last 2-3 weeks.
Yeah, you guys have been kicking ass, man. And I mean, let me just say on behalf of everybody who loves freedom, thank you for all the work that you do. I know sometimes it's a bit thankless, and I read some of the internet comments and I realize that unfortunately there's a lot of stupid people out there, man. We'll cover that in a little bit. Some of the online feedback, and then I'd like to personally explain why some of the opinions I read are just absolutely horseshit. So, with that being said, man, what cases have you you specifically been working on, or that have you worked on that we might have seen across the news?
Yeah, I mean, we've touched quite a few cases and had an impact on quite a few cases that have recently made the news. Of course, the first one in that string was the pistol brace case. So Mock v. Garland. That was one of my babies from day one. That's been a case that we've been working.
I remember we talked about this for feels like a couple of years now or something, or about a year and a half, right?
Yep, just about that. Yeah, we were talking right around actually pre day one, talking a little bit about the rule and what we were expecting and seeing stuff come out. So obviously, a couple weeks ago, we got a win at the district court where the district court judge vacated the rule in its entirety and found that we were successful in our challenge, found that the rule wasn't a logical outgrowth, which is a kind of a term of art in an Administrative Procedure Act case like Mock is. And basically said that the rule can't be sustained and needed to be vacated, which means that it, for all intents and purposes, doesn't exist.
So for an idiot like me, can you explain that in layman's terms? What the argument is? What was the grounds? First of all, what was exactly that you were attacking, and what tool did you use to attack it?
Yeah, so this one's a little bit different than when we talk about a traditional Second Amendment case, right? It's a case that's brought under the Administrative Procedure Act, which is basically the rules that Congress set for agencies to issue their own rulemakings. And it's a process that the agencies have to follow. And the agencies are issuing these rules because they're purporting to enforce federal law. Of course, we know, and some things that we'll talk about more today, we know that they do a lot more than that, right? They're
the fourth branch of government, baby. Fourth branch.
Yeah. So in their, so-called enforcement capacity, they're, of course, actually writing new law and completely broadening these statutes. And so the APA prohibits agencies from doing certain things. If they do those things, then you can sue under the Administrative Procedure Act, which is what we did here. And so basically what we said is the agency did stuff that Congress says that the agency cannot do. It's the simplest, kind of construction of it. We said, that they'd gone beyond their statutory authority, that the rule wasn't a logical outgrowth of the proposed rule. Basically what that means is the proposed rule has to be sufficiently related to the final rule so that people can actually have an opportunity to review and comment on the rule. If you have a drastic shift, then the agency is required to basically re-notice the rule, send it back out for people to review and to provide comments on, because they're required to solicit comments. The agency didn't do that here.
Does the scope of the amount of people affected and the penalty for those people, does that come into play in the argument when you're not talking about like a small, I mean, even if one individual's rights are trampled, that's one too many, and all of us that value our country as a republic understand like the value of the infinite value of the individual right. But I mean, in this particular case, you're talking about potentially tens of millions of people, and the penalty wasn't a parking ticket. You know, it was federal prison. It was 10 years in prison and $250,000 fine. Does the scope of that come into the argument at all, or is it just more technical than that, or more, I guess, administrative than that?
It is very technical, but it certainly comes into play. It certainly is part of the briefing. It certainly is part of the argument. It was part of what the judges picked up on, at the Fifth Circuit when we were arguing there. It is certainly a factor. I mean, judges are people, and so, they can also see the difference and feel the difference between one person who, might be impacted and might go to jail for a couple of years versus millions of people who here were made felons overnight by the stroke of a pen without Congress passing any law. And you're right. I mean, we're not talking about, your local, county jail. We're talking about big boy prison here. This is, federal penitentiary.
A lot of those guys wouldn't even realize they were felons. I mean, my not to throw my neighbor under the bus, but I mean, he's a retired federal agent and he doesn't keep up at the NFA or anything. I sold him a pistol a few years ago. He doesn't know that this is going on. He's not paying attention to it,
I try to explain this to people. I mean, I understand the gun market. I understand kind of where guns are bought. So, and I remind people that you and I and our friends are like in the top 0.1% of gun owners. We're part of the gun culture. We're following the gun issues. This stuff is something that's like in our daily conversation. The majority of gun owners are casual gun owners. You bought something, you put it in your safe. You may not have touched it for 4 years. You're certainly not following, gun channels and stuff. You're probably not even aware that this change. Wouldn't that be a bizarre conversation to have, like on the side of the highway? And they're like, "Oh yeah, well I have my pistol back there." Like, step out of the car, please. Like, what the fuck?
Yeah, and that was something that we highlighted in this case was that, a lot of these people don't necessarily know because ATF treated, these braces as they should have treated them, and that, they didn't magically
change the nomenclature. Yeah.
Rifle. Yeah. And for 10 years, right, it was a decade that the guidance was in place. And then just to magically shift it overnight without people even necessarily knowing what the impact was. And of course, the test that they put forth was so unknowable. It was just basically like, we'll know it when we see it, and we're going to decide when something is banned or not, right? I mean, how many people walked into a gun store over that 10-year span, bought a braced pistol off the wall, and just had no idea what they were buying, right? I mean, you're exactly right. There were millions of people impacted who knew they were impacted, and there were millions of people impacted who probably had no idea.
Yeah. So, Mike, I guess I get this question from our dealers a lot since this has happened. Everybody's very excited, and again, man, I can't thank you enough for the work you're doing on this. Clients and dealers have asked me. So, at this point, are we wide open? I mean, is it back to game on? Can people, buy these without any kind of fear of retribution? There's no more gray area. Would you say it's black and white at this point?
So I am a lawyer, so everything's a gray area.
We're going to put a disclaimer on the
disclaimer,
on the screen. No legal advice was given during this podcast.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you what. In your opinion, as a highly informed gun owner, as a gun owner, sir, like, could it be said this is pretty black and white?
Yeah. So I of course, my standard disclaimer, I might be an attorney, but I'm not your attorney. I can't.
That's exactly what you put on the screen.
Yeah. You should, obviously consult with an attorney. You should, if you're in the industry, should consult with whomever's doing your compliance stuff, but when you read the rule, or the opinion in this case, right? Judge O'Connor is very clear. It's, the rule was not a logical outgrowth, is arbitrary and capricious, and thus the rule is vacated. So until ATF or Department of Justice does something further, that's the ruling. And vacatur applies to the rule, not to the person, right? It is the rule that is vacated. It's not necessarily specific relief granted to a specific individual or a specific plaintiff. And that's because that's how the APA works, right? The relief is against the rule because the rule was unlawfully promulgated. And that's how Congress designed APA when it passed that statute that created this cause of action. So as of right now, according to Judge O'Connor, the rule is vacated until Department of Justice or ATF does something. So
what are their options? What if they wanted to pursue? Which I
start over, I guess, right?
Well, something tells me this close to an election they ain't doing shit, especially one that's not going. Like I would imagine that they're not going to get pursued at least right now. But what would their options be?
So they could appeal, right? So they could appeal up to the Fifth Circuit, fight the decision of the district court, and go from there. That would follow like what, if people follow along with our framer receiver suit, the Vanderstock case that's going up to the Supreme Court next term, right? They could follow that path. They could appeal up to the Fifth, get a decision out of the Fifth, either upholding the district court or overruling it, and then, the Supreme Court is next in the line.
How does the Chevron case apply here? Because it sounds like it's right in that vein.
So what's interesting is the law in the Fifth Circuit, even prior to now Chevron being overruled in Lover-Bright, was that an agency had to specifically invoke Chevron deference for it to even be considered in a case. And the ATF really didn't invoke Chevron deference in either the Vanderstock case or in this mock case. They basically said, as a matter of law, we win, that there is no ambiguity. And that's when Chevron comes into play, right? Is when came into play. It's going to take me a minute to get used to that one. I'm happy that I have to, but Chevron would come into play when a court would determine, or the parties would determine that the statute was ambiguous. Then the court would defer to the agency's interpretation.
So basically, the tie went to the runner.
Yeah. Well, yeah, the tie went to the guy who set up the race, picked the opponents, and also was the start-finish judge. So Chevron really wasn't a huge factor in the mock case, in the pistol brace case. So it probably won't do a whole ton to impact it moving forward, just because the agency was making the argument that as a matter of law, the statute was clear and they won. Now, of course, it forecloses any ability for them to then say now try and say like, oh, well, even if it is ambiguous, we win. They now have to
stick to the original
they can still
argument.
say that they're just not going to get the court to defer to their interpretation, if that makes sense.
That's interesting, man.
I was going to say, do y'all expect them to appeal or come out with the new rule, or what's y'all's thought? I mean,
I won't pretend to know the minds of those movers and shakers at the Department of Justice under this administration. I'm not sure they all know their minds. It could go either way, right? So the other thing that they could do is they could also try and reissue a new rule. They could attempt to come in and say, okay, well, we're going to try again, or we're going to do something different, or we're going to shift the process. Now, anytime you win a case under the APA, they can always do that, because they can always look at whatever the court ruling was for whatever reason and then attempt it again. That's, the same is true of any lawsuit, right? I mean, if you win a case and the court says you can't do X, then the state can always come back and say, oh, well, we're going to do Y, right? We see this all the time. So they could try and issue a new rule. They would have to provide it for notice and comment again. So it would be a long process, and then they have to review the notice and comment. So if they issued a proposed rule, today, let's say, it would be pretty difficult for them to get a final rule on the books prior to the election. And the whole thing with the rulemaking process, right, is it's a decision of an executive branch agency, which means the head of the executive branch gets to be the one that directs what the agency is and is not doing. So if they started the process today of, promulgating a new rule, and the Biden administration loses the election and Trump goes into office, he could immediately just walk in and end the whole thing without any consequence, essentially, before the final rule was published. So there's options available to them. They haven't done anything yet, so clearly it's not an emergency in their eyes, because they certainly didn't move immediately. So now we just kind of wait to see there's a time within which that they're required to appeal if they're going to appeal, and so that's what we're watching for.
Are you following this case out of Fort Worth? With the facts of the case are pretty bad, and this guy is most certainly not the this is not the dream plaintiff by any means, but with the prohibition for like domestic abuse accusations, this guy, and I think it's going up. Like, I know that Garland was like super enthusiastic to get this one up in front of people, specifically because this guy is a real shitbag. I mean, then again, so is Miranda, right? I mean, but you have there's case law there. Are you following this at all?
Yeah, you mean the Rahimi case?
Yes.
That one?
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah. So we followed that. We filed a brief in that case. Actually, FPC's brief really was kind of closely tracked by what Justice Thomas wrote in his dissenting opinion there. Rahimi, you could tell that Department of Justice wanted that to be the case, right?
Oh, yeah, no, they were very eager to because, I mean, it's kind of like would you have wanted to defend Miranda either, though?
Yeah, I mean, everybody deserves a defense, obviously, but yeah, I think the final straw when they ended up going and finally searching his house was that his friend's credit card was declined at a burger joint, and so he pulled out his gun and fired 2 rounds into the air because he was angry that his friend's credit card was declined. And then
he just wanted his breakfast.
Hey, you ever seen Falling Down? Like whammy burger,
when they executed the search warrant on his house, they found the gun, and then, if I remember correctly, it's like they also found a copy of the order that said that you can't have guns, with
under his gun's holding down.
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty sure this guy was.
Yeah,
he had a whole host of problems,
Yeah. So a lot of people have been really concerned about the opinion. The thing that I would say is, I think there's actually a couple good things that come out of it. I think first, we now have all 9 justices on the Supreme Court signed on to the text as informed by history test, right? So the Rahimi case was decided using the exact same process as Heller and Bruin, right? It was the exact same test. They didn't have to look to the text of the Second Amendment very closely because they had already decided, and we already knew, that keeping arms is protected under the Second Amendment. And that was the question of conduct. So all they did was really look at the history. But that was an 8-1 opinion. Every justice except Thomas signed on to the majority opinion, which, when paired with Bruin, Thomas obviously being the author of Bruin, means that every Supreme Court justice has now joined on a Second Amendment opinion that says text as informed by history is the test, which is huge, right? We're not returning to this land, in between Heller and Bruin, of this 2-step interest balancing, will they, won't they, determining the state's interest in your, right? We're not playing that game.
I will say
originalism through and through.
I will say I do have to hand it to some of the antis and the ginormous balls it takes whenever they are going against some of these safe storage laws, and they are fighting within the historical context of stuff, because they have to cite the fact that it was Native American. Our precedent for wanting to deny you the ability to keep this gun or do this thing was because it was historical. We could deny it from the Native Americans. We could deny it from blacks, and that they're actually arguing by the precedent set by true oppression and true racism, and that is the side in which they're citing.
Yeah, it's insane, right? When California first started doing this, they cited all these laws that prohibited, blacks, slaves, freedmen, and Indians, all at the time, they cited those statutes as support for their current modern gun control laws.
they cite this as like, and here you go. There's, I rest my case. They're like, do you want a fucking hood? Can let me cut some little holes in a pillowcase for you, bro?
And then in their filing, they said, we of course don't agree with the discriminatory nature of the laws, but they prove that we can do what we're doing. And I'm like, so basically what you're saying is you think Californians are equivalent to slaves. That's the line that you're trying to draw here, AG Bonta. Like, it's absolutely crazy. And yeah, they're required now, because they're forced into the historical context, which they should be. Those are the laws that they're looking to inciting. And of course, we know that, those are obviously not applicable today. They were offensive when they were enacted and enforced, and they're offensive today, right? That didn't change because the law changed, but they're certainly not applicable today. And they certainly don't apply to people who are, peaceable individuals, citizens, and the like. So it forces them into a weird context. But Rahimi is kind of another in that line. The other thing that is good about Rahimi is that it is incredibly limited. The court was it's only a 24-page opinion, right? It's 104 pages of writing, but the majority opinion, which is the only thing that's binding on anybody, is only 24 pages. And it is very explicitly limited to the question of, somebody who is a known credible threat being prohibited from possessing arms for a temporary amount of time.
So there is an opportunity for relief there.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. What's interesting is the way that specific statute works, right? 922G8 has a bunch of subsections in it, and so there's two that are of relevance. So G8C1 and C2 talk about what is in a civil protection order that qualifies it for then that person being disarmed. C1 requires an actual finding of credible threat, which is where Rahimi fell under an actual finding of credible threat. And by the way, he agreed to the order, right? He signed.
He didn't contest it.
Yeah. So, but C2 doesn't require that. And I think if you look at the court's opinion, you could even argue that if the case had proceeded and the court had not found if there was a different individual and there was no finding of credible threat, under the court's analysis, that would not be constitutional. That would be an unconstitutional prohibition.
So you don't see this as being potentially twisted into precedent for some type of red flag scenario?
It will absolutely be grabbed and twisted by whoever tries to, wants to grab and twist it. Regret that sentence. It'll certainly be abused by those who want to, take our rights, and by those who want to. Bruin is abused by those people, right? Heller was abused by those people. They're going to try and grab anything that they can to advance their agenda. That opinion, though, is so limited that if any court is really extending it beyond the idea that the text and history test applies, and that people who are determined to be a credible threat to another person can be temporarily disarmed. Those are the only two things you can take from that opinion. So any court that is going to take it much further than that, they were probably going to do so anyway under a fact pattern that they were going to do whatever they wanted to do anyway. It is very limited.
So here now go ahead.
No, just to be clear, Thomas's dissent, right? He analyzes the history. He goes in depth. First and foremost, right, this should never be a federal power. Congress was never given the authority to disarm citizens in the Constitution. If anything, this should be a state police power question. This shouldn't even be a federal statute. And Thomas's historical analysis is great, right? He does a very good job walking through and explaining why the statutes that the majority relied on aren't actually analogous to the modern law. I'm not disagreeing with Thomas. I'm not calling any of that in question. All I'm trying to do is, I know a lot of people were really concerned with Rahimi, and I just don't think it's as bad as it's been made out to be.
Oh, I'm encouraged to hear you say that. I remember before it got to that, I mean, people were praying that the district attorney out in Fort Worth would just drop the charges and almost try to render it moot, before it got shoved all the way up,
Yeah, and that's what's so crazy about that case, right? He's already in Zaki Rahimi, not Zachary, Zaki Rahimi.
Yeah, Zaki.
Already,
it's like a Jeffrey, like, hey, like you can't be scared of a Zaki.
Yeah, already in jail.
Yeah.
Is already is on several other charges.
Yeah.
Will, if convicted of those, will be forever prohibited under 922 G1 as somebody who's convicted of a crime punishable by more than 1 year's imprisonment. Like, there was no real world in which he's going to come out and be a gun owner out of this, but they pushed it on the G8, the civil protection order side. They ran that case right up to the Supreme Court almost as quickly as you could run it up there. Like, it was very clearly pushed.
It was their dream case. I mean, yeah, it was. Yeah, they were waiting for this one. they found the good defendant. So here's a question on the. Because I've been watching the discussion online and the conversation online, and it's a bit, it's pretty topical. And I have to say, I really do respect, and I agree with the position that FPC has taken, specifically on the Hunter Biden conviction for that, because that has been my, first of all, I don't know, I mean, you know this, we've talked about it before. I mean, number one, when I'm not running a gun company or building weapons, I do some work for law firms to help get firearms rights restored, to seek relief on some of those kinds of things. And I look at why people's rights are taken for a lot of reasons. I mean, anything from being erroneously reported as being adjudicated mentally defective. I mean, that happens, where somebody had a temporary like emergency hold or something, and this somehow got reported to NICS, and like, good luck getting off of that fucking list. I mean, there's a lot of complications there. But to go back to this Hunter Biden thing, it scares the hell out of me, because that is not. I am not personally aware of any other prosecution specifically like this one. And as a matter of fact, like, you can look at the lie and try stuff, and it is so rarely pursued. Like that, even conservatives, even some gun rights advocates have proposed lie and try, being something that might be worth pursuing. But it's never pursued at all. And I can't think of any kind of real conviction specifically on the use of drugs lying on a 4473 and then that turning into an actual felony conviction. Are you aware of any other case that would even be close to this?
Now, there's quite a few where people are determined to be, by the government, to be habitual drug users, or habitual users of narcotics or banned substances, regulated substances, that are then tried. This one is a little bit more unique, right, in that it's specifically also focused on the lying. It's the lying on the 4473, and that's part of the problem. And that's
which so, about 50 million people a year probably do, right? I mean, that's the fear. That's where we're heading with the conversation, is that this is, a
new avenue of attack on ways to attack us. And is it? I mean, you're right. I mean, people probably lie about all sorts of shit on 4473s. And I was going to ask you, like, all these cases, you're talking about there's habitual drug users that are prosecuted for obviously buying firearms and stuff like that. Is it typically prosecuted on its own, or is it like an add-on charge? Because that's what we see a lot of the NFA violations and stuff. Like, you have a short barrel rifle, but, you were also smuggling 18 keys of coke, and they're tagging it.
So I've seen both. Yeah, I've seen both roll through. Sometimes it's like, oh, he's getting popped under G3, which is the prohibition for habitual drug users, whatever that means to the government. And sometimes it's that, and then it turns out that they're like dealing coke or something like that, right? And it's a slew of charges. Other times, people are found with a firearm and pot together, right? And then they're like, well, can't have these two things together, and then they get charged that way. So it's, you hear about both, a lot of this too is right, is like the bias of what's being reported and what you're hearing, right? You hear a lot about Rahimi because then, the progressive media throws that in your face of like, oh, are you trying to say that these people should have guns? And so you hear about the severe cases and the bad cases, but for all of those, how many, random prosecutions are there in small towns, small cities across the country that also just get pled out, right? Most cases aren't tried these days. Prosecutors don't want to try cases.
Right.
They want you to sign a plea deal and go away so that they can say that they got a conviction and they didn't have to do any work. And that's the part of the big problem here is, right, it's not even just the fact of like, will you will you even have your day in court on some of this stuff, right? If you have this precedent that's so strongly set that the prosecutor is going to be able to walk in and go, I got you for 10 years unless you sign this paper, in which case, you can have 1 year and 2 of probation and you'll actually be able to go to your kids' baseball games, right? Like that's the kind of thing that they're doing.
Right.
It's important that this precedent's just bullshit, right? Like
I don't know anybody. I don't know anybody in the gun advocacy space, and obviously you and I live in this world. I mean, look, everybody's 1 degree, 2 degree of separation. I don't know anybody celebrating this conviction. None. And I for one am not a big Hunter Biden fan. I think he's quite guilty of a large number of crimes. This one. This is not the one that I would have liked to have seen him, convicted for. What would his defense be if for some reason this guy was not an idiot and decided to take you up on the offer to actually challenge this case? What would the grounds be?
The federal prohibition on, so-called habitual drug users being prohibited from possessing firearms is facially unconstitutional.
Yes.
There is nothing in the relevant history of firearms regulation in this nation that supports that statute, that ban, that prohibition. There is just nothing. At most, there may be some history that looks at like literally having a firearm on you while intoxicated, but even that's a line that the state would have to draw. And that's the other important thing here, right? Is it's the government's burden. They are required to meet their burden. There is no way that they could, in a fair trial, hearing, opinion, decision.
I mean, in Texas, in Texas, there's a law about being intoxicated with a concealed handgun. There's a law about being concealed with a handgun in general.
Yeah, it doesn't specify what intoxicated is, though.
Right, and also and it doesn't say you can't be intoxicated with a machine gun. And ask me how I know. See, I was arrested in Austin, Texas one time with a Mark 18 that I was putting in the trunk of my car because we were having some guests come up to the room, some friends of ours that dance, and we were having a party, and we took this Mark 18 to go throw it in the trunk to secure it. And the first person I ran into on the outside of the elevator was a police officer, and he's like, "The fuck is that?" And I'm like, "Oh, it's."
Weren't you naked though too?
Well, I had no pants on, so like that might have been like the first kind of like, hey, maybe I should investigate. Well, turns out I got arrested, and the only thing I was charged with was possession of a prohibited weapon. I was charged with possession of a prohibited weapon. It was a suppressor. It was a suppressed Mark 18. And they took my stuff, went to jail. Had to get, and then obviously within hours of being released from jail, had already been sending my tax stamps and stuff to the APD. They immediately knew what they were looking at. But that was the only thing I was charged with. I remember whenever I had not only were all of the charges dropped, we also lobbied to have defensive prosecution removed from Texas, right? So I actually got a bill signed for gun owners in Texas because before then it was a defense to prosecution to be able to show up to court and present your documents, and then your charge would be dropped. The burden of proof was on you. After my arrest, now that the burden of proof is back where it belongs on the state, and anyways, long story short, though, when went to in Austin, you have to go before a hearing to get your property returned. The the judge was like just befuddled and very angry. Remember, this is Travis County, Austin, Texas, and they were like how is this not illegal? And I was like, well, I mean, there really is no statute that says you can't be intoxicated with a machine gun. Now, handguns quite clear. And by the way, I'm not admitting to be intoxicated. Let's make that clear. Allegedly, but yeah. Anyways. But
that's a like.
I mean, I have my own bill. People ask
great.
dude, have you ever partied so hard that you got a state penal code rewritten? I'm like, I have. I actually have. Yes, I did. So, but going back to
I got a couple more ideas if you need other laws changed. Okay. I mean, I got a fully stocked bar downstairs, and I got a head full of ideas of laws that we can change. We can make this happen.
I didn't set out to be a hero. It just worked out that way, okay? You're welcome, Texas. Hey, but what happens to everybody with the medicinal marijuana card and a firearm? What happens to those people?
That's the problem, right? Under federal law right now, you would likely be considered to be in violation of 922G3. You would be a prohibited person because it is a federally controlled substance still. I mean, we'll see what the Biden administration does with this newest, delisting or relisting of
cannabis or
pot, but yeah, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
But under federal law right now, they would most likely consider you a prohibited person. And so if somebody were arrested and they had a firearm and a medical marijuana card side by side, a prosecutor could certainly make the case and try and make the case of this person is a habitual user and they have a firearm, and that's a violation of federal law regardless of what your state says. Now, this is another problem, right? This is the same thing I was saying with Rahimi. This shouldn't even be a federal government question anyway, right? This at most should be a state police power. If you look at the Constitution, you look at Article 1, nowhere in there does it say that Congress has the authority to deem, who gets to, own or who is prohibited from owning firearms. All of these laws that we're citing for history, when we're looking towards these historical regulations on firearms, are all state or colonial laws. They are not federal bans or prohibitions. This should be a state question.
Like, what stops that 4473 from turning into some sort of moral questionnaire? Like, do you drink too much? Do you watch too much porn? Do you cheat on your wife? Do you hate Joe Biden? I mean,
exactly.
Really, it could be anything.
That's the slippery slope there. I mean, because I'm not. I have to go back and look to see how it's actually written on there, but I don't think it's limited to just illegal narcotics. I think it also involves controlled substances. So, according to the American Medical Association, if you drink more than 5 drinks a week, I think they medically call that alcoholism or chemical dependence or substance dependence. And so, if just because you don't smoke pot, just because you don't, do whatever other kind of, narcotic, if you drink more than 5 drinks a week, this very well could apply to you. And we all know that laws like this are so selectively prosecuted that if you just so happen to drink more than 5 drinks a week and you're a conservative or you're an anti-narrative type person, something tells me that the odds of you being at the other end of this thing would be elevated.
Man, they wanted to stop the entire every veteran in the U.S. from owning a gun. They just put Motrin on that list.
Well, that's yeah. So so that's what it is. It's controlled substances. So it's not even an illegal drug. I mean,
no. If you were like overusing prescription drugs too, right? Like you could qualify to, and that's the problem, right?
Yeah, there you go. Painkillers. I mean, benzos for anxiety. I mean, it's a very slippery slope where this has gone, and so that's just, no one I know celebrates this shit.
Yeah,
I'm guessing Hunter hasn't taken you up.
Let's go. Like this is exactly what we exist. Like, right. I don't care who the individual is, right? If he's guilty of other crimes, prosecute him for other crimes and convict him of other crimes. The idea that the federal government can prohibit you from possessing arms because of something that you do in the privacy of your own home is offensive. Just straight up. If you didn't do something that is actually physically harmful to another being, then there's just no basis for the government to prohibit you from possessing arms.
And
if you look to history, that's the only thing, right? Like known dangerous people could have, their rights regulated for a period of time. If you didn't actually hurt somebody, then the government has no basis for disarming you.
So you would challenge the constitutionality of the question itself on the 4470. That would be the way you would attack it.
So I would challenge the constitutionality of the federal statute that the question is based on. But yes. Yeah.
No,
it's 922 G3.
It makes sense. I was actually a guest on Fox News.
Sorry.
Yeah, and it was actually the day that the pistol brace went into effect, and I was discussing that with my buddy Johnny Joe, a good guy. But they opened the segment with talking about Hunter Biden. This was right when they were announcing they were going to prosecute him for this. And because I'm a conservative guy, I think they were looking for me to encourage this or be celebrate it. And my answer was he might have a very relevant defense. I'm like, this isn't the one. This is I can't get behind this, only because I know that okay, fine, they have some sacrificial clown to kind of really the only reason he was ever convicted of this, I believe, was to take the narrative away that Trump is a political prisoner. They convicted Hunter Biden too. No one's above the law, and so he was basically a sacrificial clown. That's all this is. But knowing how the government works, knowing what what they're going to do next, there will be people that, for whatever reason, you've been deemed as an undesirable for whatever reason, and now your liquor store receipt is going to be grounds to disarm you. I don't think that's a far leap.
Is it? And it's bait, right? It's short-sighted to celebrate, and a lot of people are going, oh well, good. It's good that one of theirs is getting prosecuted for a gun charge finally, or one of theirs is finally seeing the impact of how this affects gun owners. But it's just short-sighted, because then they're going to turn around and enforce this against everyone else, right? It is bait to get you fired up about the person at the case and to get you to look beyond the actual statute and the actual law. And the actual statute and the actual law here is offensive, it's unconstitutional, and they have no authority to enforce it, or shouldn't.
Is it, we were talking about that the Supreme Court has now come out and said that we can, it's at that level that they can restrict guns temporarily from somebody if they're a threat. A lot of those laws, I think, are very vague on what constitutes a threat. I mean, is it better for them to be vague, or is it something that, on a state level or a federal level, you'd want it to be very specific? Like, yeah, you didn't get your breakfast and you shot a MAC-10 in the ceiling. Like, where does that, what's better for us? I mean, is it better for it to be vague, or better for it to be very specific, that everybody knows where the line's at and they can't abuse it?
I would always prefer to have a specific thing in which with a specific target to shoot at personally. But
yeah, that's what worries me, is that it's very vague. And any little thing you could do could be constituted as being a threat. Like, I looked at that guy the wrong way, whatever, anything.
Yeah, law should be specific and knowable, right? You should be able to, an ordinary person should be able to look at it and tell you what conduct is prohibited and what conduct isn't. That it should just be the base level for, you shouldn't need
and the ambiguity.
The ambiguity is ridiculous. You shouldn't need a lawyer to have to review something and tell you what you can or can't do. That we've gone so far down this rabbit hole that people don't even know what's regulated anymore. I mean, you guys work in one of the most regulated industries in the United States. You know how it is, right? You've got attorneys that you have to consult with on whether you can sell this, how you can market this, how you can do this, what processes you have to go through, what steps you have to go through. We've gotten to a place where everything is so overregulated, and so, the government has its fingers in everything. And it's impossible to know the full breadth of the law these days. When we're talking about these ATF rules, for example, these Department of Justice rules, frame a receiver or pistol brace, bump stocks. There's another one that came down over the last couple of weeks. Congress isn't passing extensive laws anymore, right? So not only are the laws that Congress passes incredibly confusing and very difficult for people to understand, they don't even read them. But then for every, page of law that Congress actually passes, federal agencies are promulgating 100 pages of rules in the Federal Register. Most people don't even know how to find the Federal Register,
Right.
where all of these rules and regulations are housed. And that's how these federal agencies are enforcing federal law, they claim, right?
This is where like law firms hire me sometimes as a consultant for stuff, because every defense attorney for the most part is very well versed in things like felon in possession of a gun. Like that's a pretty common one, or a gun in the commission of a crime, right? I mean, like those are all things that you see every day. But when the gun is greater than 26 inches and has a foregrip and a bit, whenever you start getting into some of this more nuanced stuff with gun law, really, they've never seen it or dealt with it or, whatever. And I mean, it's not quite as complicated probably as tax code, but it is. A lot of those laws are truly arbitrary, and it is complicated. So, and how much of that is like law, like you're saying, and how much of that is just federal rulemaking?
More of it than you are already, informed and know, and a lot of your listeners are probably informed and know, and it's more than you could ever imagine. There are some highlights, or maybe the best highlight is there is a federal regulation for how many cherries you can have in fruit salad for it to be called very cherry fruit salad.
You're saying this is real. This is a real thing.
This is real.
Yeah.
Yeah. There are federal regulations for everything, right? So that's why when you get in this argument, this has been a really interesting one, super off topic. But when people are debating whether something can be called meat or milk, right? They're like, oh, well, it's almond milk, so you can't call it milk, because there are federal regulations that specifically define sourcing and amount of product for those labels to be able to be applied to food. There is not a single thing that you touch in your daily life that is not regulated by the federal government.
Yep.
Everything that is allowing us to do what we're doing right now, not even the communication side of this, but the microphones, the desk, the chairs, every single thing that is allowing us to have this conversation is regulated in some manner by the federal government.
And Chevron, we touched on it earlier, but we shouldn't expect them to stop making regulations. I mean, it's not, I think a lot of people have this misconception that they can't do it anymore. And it's just that if it gets taken to court, they have to fight it on its merits. They don't just automatically win, if they're citing Chevron. Yeah. So it's not that they're going to stop doing it, but we just have, you as an attorney have a better chance to get them struck down.
Recourse or something, right?
Yeah, exactly right. So basically the way that Chevron operated is if a statute was ambiguous, then if challenged, the court was required to defer to the agency's interpretation of the statute, even if it wasn't the best available interpretation. So the court could acknowledge and could say, well, the agency's interpretation is the third most obvious. It's the third best, let's say, and would still have to defer to the agency's interpretation of the statute. So you were always losing the race because the agency just got deference as soon as they flew the ambiguous flag, which might actually be a flag these days. Then the agency immediately got, deference, and it is a little bit bigger because the other side of this is it also created this really perverse incentive system. So contrary to popular opinion, Congress actually doesn't like passing laws because laws are things that they do that then go onto their record that people can hold them accountable for. So Congress's favorite thing to do and only thing that they really care about is raising money so that they can get reelected.
Yes.
But they have to do something. So what they do is, because of Chevron in part, they're passing incredibly ambiguous laws and are getting just enough on paper so that they could pass it. And then they give it to an agency and say, well, you guys figure out what the hell it means and you guys figure out how to enforce it. And that's why there's so many pages of regulation for every law. And so then the agencies are taking this and going, oh, I get deference, so I can draft whatever I want. And in fact, there was a poll of people responsible at federal agencies for writing regulations. And it was anonymous, and they were asked whether or not they considered Chevron. And there used to be, it still kind of is, another deference model called Auer deference or Seminole Rock deference, which is slightly different, but is relevant. And the people taking the poll asked them, do you consider Chevron, do you consider deference when writing rules? And the vast majority of them said yes. And so they knew this. They weaponized the idea that they got deference. And so it has permeated the entire system of how we get law in this country, how regulations are written, and then how they're proposed. So it will hopefully also kind of deter that incentive system, or will start to wear away at that incentive system. But at its core, yes, this isn't going to stop them from writing rules and regulations. It's just going to change the way that these court cases come out.
So yeah, I've argued with buddies of mine that complain about like the gridlock of Congress, the gridlock of the Senate, the gridlock, whatever. And my position is, thank God, I'm glad that there's gridlock, right? Because I mean, it should be fundamentally hard to drastically change anything. And I like the fact that every 4 years there's not some kind of insane swing to one side or the other for anything. That's what it would look like, right? Especially with how polarized and just how that rift is now. How could you run a business? How could you do anything if there was that type of volatility? With that being said, considering that the fourth branch of government, these regulatory agencies and these bureaucracies, well, they, in a sense, that is where the volatility is coming from, right? Because you appoint a new head to this department, you appoint a new head to that, whatever, blah, 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 nominate a guy here, and they're carrying out that volatility. So it's not Congress that's that has passed some kind of law, or it's not something that. But I guarantee you that if your good friend, who I know how much you loved and liked him a lot, I could tell every day, was Chipman. Which, by the way, once in a while, just for the shit of it, I share that fucking video y'all put out, or it was like, fuck you, like what? So fuck, I heard you. I just wanted to hear it again. Like, fuck David Chipman. I what? I heard what you said. I just wanted to hear you say it. Anyways, the greatest like animated meme ever. But appointing that guy to the director of the ATF, that is going to have some serious consequences, and I would imagine for energy, for education, for transport. Our good friend Pete Buttigieg for transportation and everything else. So while I like the gridlock of Congress, that election still absolutely, in a sense, has consequences, because those departments are now run by, and it's getting more and more. These things are being run by activists and extremists, and I would reject it even if it was the other way. I would not want. I'm a conservative, but I would not want necessarily a conservative activist or extremist regulating anything, even on my behalf. I would I'd like to kind of keep it down the middle, to be honest.
Well, the answer here isn't to you don't need to go in and promulgate better regulations, or regulations that
you need less regulation.
When Trump ideology. You need to get rid of some damn regulations. It is so unknowable, and they're weaponized, and that's the thing, right? So people are paying a lot more attention now too, right? Especially in our space. Nobody talked about federal regulations until the bump stock rule, right? In the gun space, it was very uncommon, unless you were actually manufacturing or paying attention to the changes in a 4473, which happened via rulemaking and stuff like that. Very few people were talking about it. Now it's the topic, the topic of the day. Very few people 5 years ago knew what Chevron was, had ever even heard of Chevron deference or the idea of what it was. And now I think people are paying more attention, but it's still so niche, and there are so many places. So people are now paying attention to what the ATF is doing via rulemaking. People have paid attention to kind of, what the EPA is doing after that case that came out last year that talked about the major questions doctrine. But all of these regulations are weaponized. So, for example, the Endangered Species Act. The Endangered Species Act is weaponized in order to lock up land across the United States, right? It's used in order to designate species as endangered that aren't endangered, or basically no species has ever been removed from the Endangered Species Act list because they have been recovered, even though several have.
They do that here in San Antonio when every time they try to put in a new fucking road, it's like, oh, there's a nematode in the freaking aquifer or whatever. We can't build a road.
Yeah. for oil production in the Permian Basin, there's the dune sagebrush lizard, which is apparently a unique and protected species. There was a case back in, when I was still doing Endangered Species Act work, there was a bone cave harvestman spider in Texas that's basically like a daddy longleg. They're like, well, it's the only location. And so they made it to where like Boy Scouts couldn't develop a campsite that they were, they own, by the way, they lock up your land too, right?
Yeah.
It's not even just necessarily like land that the state owns or the federal government, which shouldn't be able to own the land, owns. It's your land. If you own a piece of land and you have an endangered species on it, you can't do anything. You can't develop it. You can't, a take, what it's called, of an endangered species includes like scaring it or harassing it.
This happened to a friend of mine in San Diego. This guy was a team guy, and he had bought like his dream lot, like there in the hills, and he fought for like a couple of years to be able to clear the brush off the property to be able to build. And he bought like a pretty expensive lot, and you're like fighting with multiple agencies to clear stuff to build. And then I remember like a couple of years later, like these massive wildfires broke out in California and just devastated this entire area, and everybody was very distraught, except my buddy, who was happy as fuck to see the whole place burn, so he can finally finally build on the lot.
Well, that's one place I know, they talk about it being a problem is in California because they want to clear and, create fire breaks and do all this stuff to prevent the fires, and they can't because some fucking lizard or whatever lives on this land, and it's like, all right, well, the whole town's going to burn up,
Yeah, the reason that you have massive forest fires in the U.S. and they're increasing has nothing to do with climate change. It's because we no longer manage forests because you can't get through the federal regulation and the red tape in order to actually manage forests.
Well, you bringing up climate change is highly relevant, especially in this, because if you look at the way Chevron is being discussed in the media, this is some giant win for oil companies and energy companies, and this is this is the death to the country, the world because of climate. And I'm like. And it's brilliant how they can spin something to which like your freedom to move and act and transact. I mean, regardless of your political affiliation, like yours is the one at stake. You should be happy that there are less people able to tell you necessarily what to do. Because I mean, I don't. It almost doesn't matter to some degree who a politician is. Really, your life is, I guarantee you, considerably more impacted by these regulatory agencies and by the rule stuff than anything else ever is.
When Trump came into office, he had put out an executive order saying that for every regulation that came out, they had to get rid of 2. Did that actually have an effect? I mean, that reduced the amount of bullshit, or?
It was the first time that the Federal Register decreased in size for like 6 decades or something. Like that.
Yeah, that's right.
Now, what they did is these career bureaucrats got clever, and so when they would issue a new rule, they would like withdraw 2 prior or repeal 2 prior. Now, it's not repeal; it's not a law, but
withdrawal. Whatever.
And they would just write all 3 into the new rule, so they wouldn't actually lose anything, but then just consolidate it all into one, because that's what federal bureaucrats do, right? Like, but that's why. So one, I mean, I wish that cases went as far as CNN says they do. My job would be a hell of a lot easier if like Bruin did what CNN said Bruin was going to do, where everybody could just own whatever they wanted whenever they wanted.
Yeah, I was pissed, man. Kyle made me take up my vending machine. I had Uzis in there. I had some grenades, and we had a vending machine out front. But yeah.
But the reason why this Chevron case is so scary to them is that it cuts to the heart of progressivism and the progressive model. Yeah. The progressive model is the development of bureaucracy. It's this idea that some people can be trained and educated to know better than you how to manage your life. And those people need to have the power to manage your life. That is the heart of progressivism. That is the heart of bureaucracy. And so when you remove that ability or when you cut at that ability just a little bit, right, that scares them because that's the heart of their system that they're designing. This idea that you need a PhD in environmental regulation to lead an environmental department that sets rules and regulations on how you can conduct your life and your business. You need a PhD in food science to tell you what food is and isn't and how it has to be labeled to protect you from yourself, right? That is progressivism at its core.
Yeah, or you
and
get a guy that
is scary.
Yeah, you get a guy that dresses like a woman and steals people's luggage at the airport. Like that's who I want telling me what to do with my nuclear waste. I know
you get like Pete Buttigieg up there as a department, Secretary of Transportation, or I'll attack our side, Rick Perry, the Secretary of Energy. The dude probably couldn't install a light switch, and he's running our nuclear reactors. I mean, I love the guy, but just stuff like that,
Yeah, well, I mean, again, I think until there is some type. Well, first of all, let's just say that from you and I know agree. Deregulation, less regulation is always going to be the best optimal answer, at least for the people and for the republic. Man, is less, right? But you damn sure don't want activists and fanatics of any flavor in these positions, and with how things are going, the trajectory of the national conversation, what seems to be like the growing rift. We're watching two different movies at this point. There's not. It'd be one thing if you sat down and you could argue with somebody based upon your interpretation of the facts, and then Bob's interpretation of the facts, and then you have some kind of discussion about that. Well, there has to be an established set of facts in which to make an observation or an interpretation. There is no more of that. We're watching two completely separate movies. I don't necessarily see how this gets better. I don't see how this improves. I mean, if anything, it's getting much, much worse. So I know we're about to wrap up here soon. A couple things, though. I want to make sure that people know, number one, like for Sons of Liberty, Kyle and I, we have always been ardent and hardcore supporters of FPCs. I think you guys are probably like, if there was anybody I picture being like out there like a street fighter, like just a brass knuckles and a bike chain out there looking for a fight, dude. I mean, it's FPC. You guys are badasses, and we are grateful for you. We will always support you. And I really want to encourage more people to support. Here's the thing. I talk to people who can't bring themselves to pull a lever for a candidate who might be pro-gun because they lean to the other side. Well, FPC is a perfect way to get involved in protecting the Second Amendment without having to get into necessarily politics. Donating to the FPC to bring these lawsuits, you can vote for whoever you want and make sure that FPC, though, is well-funded to go out there and tear down these really draconian and unconstitutional gun laws. This is a good way for people who do not want to be involved in politics to still fight for the Second Amendment, donate to FPC. And man, I gotta tell you, right now, the frame and receiver, that's the next big battle you guys are having. Can you tell us just a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, at first, I just thank you for the kind words. We appreciate it. We've loved working with you guys, going back and forth. I love what you guys do. I mean, I think what's really cool with what you guys are doing at Sons is that you are owning the philosophy too, right? And you live it up, but you're also talking about a lot of things that other people aren't talking about, and you're building them into your branding and into your marketing. And it's just so important that people actually think about, what's the purpose of the Second Amendment? What was it designed to protect? It wasn't, hunting and self-defense from a criminal who broke down your door. Those were other important purposes, right? But you guys are willing to have the hard conversations and talk about the actual purpose of being armed, the actual purpose of owning your own firearms. And, just on another level too, you guys are making good shit. My son's rifle is by far my favorite one. So that thing's awesome. So
yeah, man.
We appreciate your guys' support and what you guys are doing. I love the calls to, the Green Dragon Tavern and everything that you guys are doing. This displeases the king build set. I greatly upset that I missed out that opportunity to grab one of those, because that is one of the coolest things I've seen. So you guys are doing awesome stuff.
The silence of our industry is a bit disappointing, because we collectively we have the resources, I think, to be less shit upon, but there doesn't seem to. Sometimes I'm just largely I'm disappointed by either the silence or the unwillingness to come together for at least a common cause. And when I say us first, them, it's us first. Michael Bloomberg, he's not hurting on cash, man. Neither are some of these organizations. Going back to the pistol, the frame and receiver rule, what can we expect from that? And also, what is y'all's angle of attack on that? What is y'all's position on that?
So that case is currently being briefed at the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court has agreed to hear it. It's going to be argued next term. The government filed its opening brief, just recently. So that is currently being briefed. So you'll see kind of the papers come through. You'll see the briefs come through. Excuse me. It'll be argued probably in October at the Supreme Court, and then the Supreme Court will decide when it issues an opinion in the case, right? Usually they hold the bigger opinions until later in the term, but it's being argued so early in term that it might not wait until like a June, July sort of thing. So that's up in the air, just timeline-wise.
Is there any hope at all for some of the companies that have been absolutely devastated by some of these rulings or some of these, rulemaking? You and I both have personal friends that have been,
Dude, SB Tactical. I mean, some of these companies.
Well, SB Tactical, but a lot of our buddies up in Washington State, guys that were named in that suit for, having sent, an incomplete, frame or something. I mean, is there any
relief
for those guys, or are there damages at all in something like this? I mean, or is this system? I mean, obviously, I know they're all fighting and they're going to continue to fight, and I love them all for it and I respect it. But is this one of those things where you're left with just a smoldering pile of shit, and that's all that's left? I mean, yes, granted, victory and our republic is better for it, but are they just fucked? Some of these guys.
Obviously, it's going to completely depend on everybody's individual case and facts and where it sits. The biggest thing is that when the Supreme Court speaks, it's very obviously of nationwide applicability, right? It is completely and utterly applicable across the country.
Right.
So whatever the Supreme Court says can be used in every individual case and all of these different, defenses in order to defend people on, whatever charges they may be facing, or, it can impact all of those things.
Right.
In a lot of cases, you can get attorney's fees, so you can, potentially recoup your losses, which, happens in cases from cases.
I happen to know of one that's real expensive. Whoa.
In something that would completely offend the the founders and framers is the idea that government has immunity, right? And they have immunity from damages a lot of times. And so there's many instances in many of the cases that we fight, we can't get damages against the government because they've deemed themselves immune, which is incredibly offensive and just goes against the entire, basically, founding of our nation. But there are very limited circumstances in when you can actually get damages against a government. You're certainly not going to be getting them against a legislature, like for passing a law. And then even then you get to a place, I won't unearth the qualified immunity conversation this late in the game, but then you get into this, like, when can people be held accountable if they can kind of hide behind the shield of government? And so in a lot of those instances, there is not an opportunity for you to get damages and for you to recoup anything
government's broke anyway,
maybe just your actual expenditures.
No, it's unreal. I mean, you and I have both seen the abuse of many entities and the destruction that it has on real people, and there are real victims, real livelihoods destroyed, real reputations destroyed. I mean, we've seen, we see, and we've known these people that it's happened to, and even after they prevail, their life is irrecoverable many times. Marriage is irrecoverable. I mean, they come in and they just destroy everything, and then, you ever read 3 Felonies a Day? That book, 3 Felonies?
I have not. I have heard of it, but I haven't read it.
You would enjoy it. Listen, man, we need to get you down here sometime soon. I'd like you to come by, hang out, come to headquarters, and we'll go out and do some shooting and, a lot of other freedom stuff.
Yeah, for sure. Happy to come back. Last time I went down, I left with buying a gun, so it's works for me too. I mean, I got more money to spend. I guess.
We have more for you. So
Yeah, hey, we'll put a. Is there a way I can make a pistol brace that bumps? Anyways, you need one of those. I'm gonna get some work on it right now.
Perfect. I need the case cite on it. You
Yeah.
gotta put the case citation on it.
That's right. Hey, brother, it's good to see you, Cody. Man, hit us up, and then, like I said, keep us on the speed dial for anything we can do for all these other big fights you got coming up.
Thanks for joining us today right here at the Liberty Tree Studio. But be sure to visit us at solgw.com for hard use blasters, badass swag, and much, much more.